Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to George Croft's American Music Show. Today's episode is Buck Owens and the Streets of Bakersfield. Alright, I also have some dates coming up, so come out and see me. For April 10th, I'll be at the Hard Rock Hotel and Casino doing the whiskey dinner for those guys. The 17th, we're at the Stanislaus County Farm Bureau dinner in Turlock. And April 18th, I'll be at the Sonora Tap Room in Sonora, California. And then for May 1st, I'll be at Esplanade at Turkey Creek. And the 10th, we're at Rancho Roble Vineyards in Lincoln. And May 31st, we're at the Reno River Fest. I'm very excited about that one. So if you guys are in the Reno area, come on out. And then in June, we're doing the Colusa County Fair, June 14th. And June 20th, we're back at Red Bus Brewing, which I did a couple of weeks ago, and that was fantastic. So come on out. Hopefully we'll see you there. We are also brought to you by Tyler & Co. Marketing, providing top-notch photography and videography services to Northern California. Tyler & Co. is your one-stop shop for social media content, product videos, commercials, promotional videos, and best of all, weddings and events. I dare you to take a quick scroll down their Instagram page at TylerandCo_marketing and tell me it doesn't look like a Hollywood production. If you want people to ask you who the executive producer of your wedding was, call Tyler & Co. If you want it to look like you got paid just to be in your wedding photos, call Tyler & Co. If you want the video of your first dance to look like it qualified you for the Screen Actors Guild, call Tyler & Co. And best of all, your future father-in-law is going to forgive you for everything, when he finds out how much money you're saving him on this wedding by using Tyler & Co. marketing to capture your big day. So visit tylerandcofilms.com for all your photography needs. That's tylerandcofilms.com. Okay, so Buck Owens is another one of these characters in country music that has a stellar career and is attached to all these other artists. He's another one of these kind of cornerstone artists that has an influence across the whole genre. And but he starts off very similar to Johnny Cash. Buck Owens, so he's born in 1929, so he's a few years younger than Hank Williams. And he's born to sharecroppers in Texas. And again, this is where the Dust Bowl is moving people around. Like, you know, the Dust Bowl hits, and it's like the Dust Bowl and Great Depression at the same time. So the people in Texas and the Midwest are just getting smashed economically by this deal. And ironically, the Dust Bowl was like a man-made tragedy because it comes around by people moving west to get, you know, farmland and kind of try to scratch a living out. But the farming practices of the time were not very ecologically sound because this is you're talking the plains where this was thousands of years of grass and buffalo running around. Well, now you get American farmers in there, and the first thing they do is they till up the soil to plant row crops. You can only till the soil so many times, and you're slicing off all the roots that are holding everything down. Well, that's fine until you get a bad water year. And as soon as a drought hits, which it does, everything dies, and there are no roots holding any of the dust down. So that's when the winds pick up, and, you know, there's a story about dust from Oklahoma gets blown all the way to Washington, D.C. at one point. But so this is just this, and it's all little farmers. It's not like some big giant corporate thing that just did it to the whole, you know, Midwest. Everybody's working on their own, trying to scratch out their own living, but they kind of cause this disaster. So Great Depression, drought, Dust Bowl, nobody's making any money. And so that's what Buck Owens is born into. So he's born in 1929, and then in 1937, and his parents are, you know, farmers, so that's what he grows up doing initially. He's in the fields with his parents, similar to Johnny Cash. And in 1937, his dad decides, we're going to California. So he kind of does the Beverly Hillbillies thing, loads the family up, and they hit the road going to California. They make it to Mesa, Arizona, and the truck breaks down. And they don't have the means to really go any further. So they end up just getting jobs in Mesa, Arizona as farm workers, and they're able to scratch out enough of a living to, like, make rent, and but they end up in Mesa, Arizona, even though their intention was to get to California. And this is where Buck's musical career sort of takes off. Because actually, so Buck's real name was Alvis Edgar Owens Jr. And at 4 years old, they had a family mule named Buck. And he just decided he liked it and started calling himself Buck after the family mule. And that sticks. So everybody starts calling him Buck from the time he's like 4. So then, like I said, so in 1937, they end up in Mesa, Arizona. And he starts playing music. He gets a hold, I think his parents bought him a mandolin first. And that's kind of his escape, from the manual labor of the day. He'd go home, play music. He's listening to the radio. Kind of similar to Glenn Campbell. He's playing along with the radio. He's totally self-taught. And so when he's 13, I think, 13, he drops out of school to work full-time in the fields. But at the same time, so he's doing that, but he's also playing wherever we'll let him in. So he's developing as a musician at this time. But he's doing everything. He's washing cars. He's, working in the fields. He's doing, like, literally anything he can to scrape some money together. And in 1945, he gets in with a local radio station in Mesa. I think it's called KTYL. And he joins a band. I think he starts a band with Terrell Ray, who his last name was Terrell Ray Britton. And so it was Buck and Britt was the name of their little duo. And they start, playing gigs around Mesa, Arizona. And it's around this time in 1948, he meets a lady named Bonnie Campbell. And they're really young. I think they're 18 and 19 when they get married, soon thereafter. And Bonnie Campbell, and now, Bonnie Owens, becomes her own kind of cool character in this story. But so they're immediately attracted to each other. And she would later say, like somebody said, oh, when you fell in love with Buck, she would later correct me, like, we fell in lust, which was correct. She's pregnant soon after. And so they end up having 2 kids, Buddy and Michael. And, while they're in Mesa touring around, playing gigs, she's a big part of Buck's musical career too. So Bonnie's like singing with him and playing gigs, and they're teamed up to do the music thing at this point. So, at this time though, because Buck's still working whatever job he can get his hands on, part of what he did was truck driving. And throughout his truck driving travels, he drove through Bakersfield, California, and it just kind of stuck in his mind. Like there was kind of a beginning music scene there. And so he had that little kernel of, he knew where Bakersfield was and he liked it. And then, in 1951, so he's 22 years old with 2 kids and a wife. They move to Bakersfield for the music opportunities. And so he's still working some odd jobs here, but pretty quickly he starts getting work as a session musician. Just this kind of similar to Glenn Campbell. He's getting work through his guitar pretty quick while he's working all these other side jobs and stuff. And he ends up at a club called the Blackboard. And the Blackboard became the laboratory that would develop Buck Owens, because he was playing 7 nights a week for like 7 years or something. He spends a lot of time in the Blackboard and just kind of honing his own sound, because at this time he knew in Nashville, even at this stage in the early, in the, the mid 50s or early 50s, even at that time, Nashville had already gotten this like corporate sort of grip on it. So, and this is, we're talking the early days of this is when Patsy Cline and Willie Nelson, all these, that whole story is happening at the same time, but he'd already gotten a sense that Nashville wasn't where he wanted to go, and LA didn't really fit either. And Bakersfield basically meant freedom and opportunity. Nobody was telling him what to play. Nobody was making him stick to a certain style. He could play his electric guitar as loud as he wanted, and that's what he wanted to do. So he ends up in the Blackboard and just crushes for 7 years playing, this rowdy. The Blackboard is like a honky tonk bar, so it's just people dancing, loud stuff going on, fights happening all the time. Just a real cauldron of, cooking the best out of all the musicians in there until they're, it's the pressure that turned that coal into diamonds. And and as he's doing that, as he's developing his skill, that's how he starts getting work as a session musician. And he starts working for Capitol Records as a session musician, but quickly gets recognized as a talent. And so I think he played in 1953. He played on a track for Tommy Collins, and that's what really kind of got him in the door with Capitol Records. So he's, going to LA playing, session sets, and then he's, still staying in Bakersfield. And then, so in 1953, as Buck is, becoming this local staple in the Blackboard and he's, getting session work, he's starting to get a taste for success here. And for all Buck Owens' success. So usually what happens in these stories that we've told so far is that this is where the artist will get into drugs and alcohol hard. Like that's what happened to Johnny Cash. That's what happened to Hank Williams. That's what happened to Glenn Campbell. Like this stage is where they start to part of it is they're getting run through the ringer on, tour dates and stuff. So guys start to lean on substances to kind of help them through it. Buck Owens does not do that. And he, for his entire career, is known to run a tight ship. Like he doesn't do drugs and he doesn't drink very much. And he expects that of the people around him. And he becomes known as this straight-laced dude. His vice was the girls. And he doesn't seem to have had any mechanism to stop himself from female attention, because even at this early stage where he's just working as a session musician and he's kind of a local star, he starts kind of running around on Bonnie. And she knows he's kind of out in the open with it, and she gets tired of it, and they get divorced in 1953. And she sticks around, she's still part of his, music career sort of. And actually in later years, they have a pretty amicable relationship. It's just kind of out in the open. Buck likes to get around. I'm not here for that. So they got divorced. And, so pretty soon after that, in 1955, Buck gets married 5 times before this is over, by the way. But so soon after that, I think it was 1955, he meets another lady named Phyllis Buford, and they get married in 1956. And they have another son, Johnny, who's born later that year. And this is where Buck's his development starts to kind of take off, while he's also kind of getting shoved into this cookie cutter at Capitol Records. So he gets signed to Capitol Records to make his own music, but they are pretty heavy-handed in their input. They don't want they're controlling, the strings and the volume of things, and they're kind of giving him certain songs to do. So his first record is kind of a flop. Nobody, he wasn't happy with it, and the market did not like it. It was, it's just another country doo-woppy sort of, kind of hayride type of country stuff. And he did it for the money, but it was not what Buck wanted at all. And to the point where he kind of slows down and he stops, producing for Capitol Records. He's still signed to them, but he's not making any new records after that first one. And basically, the way those contracts work is that they get you for X amount of songs or X amount of records. You don't have to crank them out. And at least in this case, he didn't have to crank them out immediately. They just got the rights until he made X amount of songs. So he stops making music at this point, or not. Well, he stopped making records, and he starts to feel pretty squeezed. And at this stage in the game, he'd met a guy named Dusty Rhodes, who Dusty Rhodes is another kind of pivotal character in Buck's life. He's not, obviously, he's not the wrestler. Just kind of funny the way things work out. This is a guy, his real name is Dusty Rhodes, and he becomes friends with Buck Owens. Well, Dusty Rhodes was also tied in with the music industry, and he kind of became a mentor to Buck. And at this point, we're at this kind of low point. He's just remarried to Phyllis. I think, right. Yeah. Phyllis. Yeah. He's married to Phyllis, and this is in 1958, I think. Yeah, in 1958, he gets word that there's an opening at a radio station in Washington State. So somehow Dusty Rhodes put him on to the opportunity. I don't fully understand the connection there, like how Dusty Rhodes knew about that, or it was just kind of industry connections. Hey, Buck, there's an opening up in Washington. I think you'd be the right guy to go take it. And so he does. So Buck and Phyllis move to Puyallup, Washington, and he basically, the deal that he gets is he gets a third ownership of this little local radio station. And part of the deal is, so he gets the radio station and he gets to be the host of a live TV show, which was called the Bar K Jamboree. And that was actually a pretty solid deal for Buckanish, for this period of time. It was a steady paycheck. He's playing music every week. He's, finding other artists that he likes and, putting them on TV every week. And I think the TV station was called KTNT. And so he starts that relationship and, things start going pretty well. At this stage of the game in Washington, he meets a guy named Don Rich. And Don Rich and Buck Owens would become just two peas in a pod. Like, they're basically inseparable. Musically, each was exactly what the other one was after. And even though Don Rich was, I think, 16 years younger than Buck Owens, I think, at the time, but he gets introduced to him while he's in Washington. There's a couple of different versions of how they met. Like, they were like I think the drummer or the bass player of his group at the Bar K Jamboree is the one that finds Don Rich because he's like this talented fiddle player. And one version of the story is that guy just hires Don Rich without even talking to Buck first, and he'd already paid him. And there was like a disagreement over like, hey man, it was $20 at the time. And it was like, hey man, you're spending $20 on this guy that I haven't even met. Like, what? You didn't bring me in on this decision at all. And that guy was basically like, hey man, this kid's really good. If you don't like him, I'll pay him the $20. And so Don Rich ends up joining the band for the Bar K Jamboree. Now, the other version of the story is somehow they also meet in a restaurant, which I don't know if this is just their first meeting, like they knew of each other, deals are already signed, they were just like initial meeting kind of thing. I don't really understand how this works, but they end up in a restaurant that I thought was just another little funny history thing. It's called Steve's Gay 90s Restaurant. And nowadays, that might mean something else. At the time, the gay 90s referred to the 1890s, and in the late 50s, early 60s, when people talked about the restaurant that was like the gay 90s, that was the way we think of like a 50s cafe, like the kind of, you'll see, you go into a Five Guys or whatever, and it's like kind of modeled after the 1950s, jukebox in the corner and, tile everywhere. The way we feel about 1950s stuff, that was them for the 1890s. And so they end up, anyway, I just thought it was a funny name for a restaurant. So he meets Don Rich there. They end up hitting it off just fine. And then in 1961, this is where Buck Owens had a really good business sense. And immediately, I mean, even at this stage, so he has part ownership in a radio station now. He started to do financially okay, but he always had a really good business sense. And he decided that he wanted to start his own music publishing company. And initially there's a bunch of pushback, like, you don't know anything about publishing. Like, how are you going to do this? And Buck's attitude, I saw him saying in an interview that he was just like, what do publishers do aside from take half the money? And nobody had a really good answer for that question. So he launches Blue Book Publishing, and becomes like a real cornerstone of his later empire that he's going to build business wise. So starts his own publishing company. And then in 1962, he moves back to Bakersfield because at the time so in 1961, I think, he sends a letter to Capitol Records, and he's basically like, hey, because remember, he's still tied into the contract from Capitol Records. He still owes them some songs or whatever. But he has no interest in getting back into this being told what to do with his music kind of thing. So he writes a letter to Capitol Records saying, let me go. Like, if you're like, either let me do my thing, or I'd like you to release me so I can apply my trade doing this stuff up here. And Capitol Records just flip his letter over and write a response on the back and say, nope, we want you to come back. Like, you can record whatever you want. Like, come on down. We'll let you record. So soon thereafter, he moves back to Bakersfield and he takes Don Rich with him. So Don Rich follows him back to Bakersfield, and they start, so they set about making records, and things start to go pretty good. And this is where we have a little tie-in with the previous story. So this is in 1962. Buck Owens' band that he had kind of started to gather up. Some members kind of came and went. It wasn't super solid initially. Well, a young bass player named Merle Haggard shows up. And Merle Haggard's story, so like the tie-in here is that in 1959, Merle Haggard was an inmate at San Quentin Prison and had seen Johnny Cash perform on, I think it was New Year's Day of 1959, I think it was, that he sees Johnny Cash perform. And quickly it was that, like, and Merle Haggard's life at the time was kind of a disaster. Like, he'd gotten married right before he went into prison, which was actually really interesting because he serves 3 years of a 15-year sentence, which is kind of nuts because it was like for a botched robbery where it was like, and a bunch of other stuff. He had like a bunch of petty crimes and everything. He ends up, the robbery is what gets him, in prison. But the sentencing rules back then were super weird. It was like the window was crazy. It was like, this requires either anything from 6 months to 15 years was how much or 16. It was 6 months to 16 years was the window that the judge had to operate in. And the judge hits him with a 15-year sentence. And then that's how he ends up in prison. And then only 3 years later, he's released for good behavior and for, like he had enrolled and he was participating in some like rehabilitation programs and stuff. And he'd like been teaching he'd been teaching music to other inmates and stuff. He kind of proved himself to be a useful guy. And so the parole board lets him go after only 3 years. And then I think he was on probation for like 3 years after that or something. But so this is the time window. Merle Haggard gets out of prison and after seeing Johnny Cash has decided, I can do music. Like, that's something I can do. And so he starts playing at every little band and every little gig that he can get his hands on while also working side jobs. And he's not famous at all. This is like knee deep in the grind of trying to make music work. He somehow gets hooked up with Buck Owens' band as a bass player. And he's only with that band for like 6 months or 6 or 9 months or something. It's just within 1962. But it's during that time, Buck Owens' band didn't have a name at that point. And Merle Haggard is the one that is credited with the idea, hey, you should call it the Buckaroos, which is, as soon as you know that was Merle Haggard's idea, it makes all the sense in the world because it was like the cowboy tie-in with like the vaquero thing for California and Buck's name. And so it kind of like, it was just a perfect, oh yeah, you should call it the Buckaroos. And so Merle Haggard just puts his stamp on Buck's career like that. And then, and that name sticks. I mean, the band is called the Buckaroos from thenceforward, even though Merle Haggard leaves the band just a few months later. Ironically, Merle Haggard goes on. So remember in 1953, Bonnie and Buck had gotten divorced, but she was still around and she was still helping out with the music stuff. She ends up marrying Merle Haggard later, like I think in 1970 something, I think. We'll go over that when we do a Merle Haggard episode. But Merle Haggard marries Bonnie Owens at some point, and that it doesn't seem to have caused any conflict at all. Like those three, like Merle always loved Buck Owens, and like enough time had gone by that didn't create any animosity or toxicity at all between any of them. So, but anyway, so this is 1963 that we're in. This is where things start to really pick up for Buck Owens. He gets his first number one hit, which is Act Naturally. And this is to people at the time were super cliquey about music. And it was like you either listen to rock and roll or you listen to country or you listen to jazz. And blurring the lines between genres was really frowned upon. People got really upset. And but Buck just knew what kind of music he liked to make, and he didn't like to put a stamp on exactly what genre he was in. This is kind of a trend, with some other artists at the time. So much so that the Beatles actually covered Act Naturally in 1965. And some people got mad about that, but Buck Owens thought it was great. He loved the Beatles, and he thought, that was just a cool feather in his cap that the Beatles covered one of his songs. And but anyway, so that's his first number one hit, is Act Naturally. And then him, like I said, so 63, 62, him and Don Rich are really starting to kind of gel, and their musical styles are really starting to come out front. And let's see here, he gets 1964, he gets Together Again, which is another number one, and then 65, he gets I've Got a Tiger by the Tail, which is also a number one hit. And then so things are really, the mid to late 60s, momentum is just cooking. He's playing big. He plays Carnegie Hall somewhere in this time, which is nuts for a country band. Like that caught everybody by surprise. And then things kind of start to slow down a little bit here. So he's experiencing all the success. He's cranking out number one after number one, And actually, there's I think it was 1966, if I'm not mistaken. He actually writes a letter, like an open letter that he puts in a magazine that says, I will play no song that is not a country song. I will never be anything but a country artist. And he's kind of trying to he feels the energy of the crowd starting to get like, oh, this isn't country, blah, 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 blah. And so he sort of puts this letter out like, I'm a country artist. I will make no music that's not country, sort of, But then he turns right around. The first song that he puts out after writing that letter is he covers Chuck Berry's Memphis, and then he later does Johnny B. Good. So he loved Chuck Berry, and he like that style of music, like that was just right up his alley. But if Buck Owens does it, it's kind of a country song. So it's almost like Buck Owens was kind of hitting the crowd with like a Jedi mind trick of like, these are not this is not the rock and roll you're looking for. And then, but he still plays whatever songs he feels like playing, but he just does it with, his Fender Stratocaster and makes it sound as, Buck Owens country style. And, but he never, even though he writes that letter, it doesn't seem to deviate his song or music decisions at all. He just kind of like gets the crowd to give him a chance with this letter, and it works. I mean, that seems to work. But in 1969, he takes a job on a show called Hee Haw. And this is where we start to see kind of a slow down low point in Buck's career, because he was this like rock star character. Everybody loved him because he bucked the music system. He didn't just settle in Nashville. He didn't settle in Los Angeles. He did his own thing, started his own publishing company, like brought Bakersfield into the light as this like country music door number 3 kind of. And people loved that. So when he joins Hee Haw, his character on Hee Haw is not like a nudie suit wearing rock star. He's wearing backwards overalls with a straw hat, and he's this kind of country bumpkin character. And he comes right out and says, they were paying me $40,000 a year, and if you do that for a few years, I like you. So he didn't care. I mean, it's not that he didn't care, but like he chooses that as money's coming in, and he just had to go film episodes for a couple of weeks at a time, and he's getting $40,000 a year in 1969. Yeah, early 1970s. That's a lot of money, which is, helpful to the rest of the empire. But this is kind of where the hits kind of stop rolling, because a couple of years later in 1974, Don Rich, who the two of them really, it cannot be understated how much those two really grew together. And like Don Rich actually, he comes on as a mandolin player, but he quickly learns to play guitar from Buck Owens. But then he kind of like surpasses Buck Owens, where he becomes the front man. He like the lead guitar player kind of, and his harmonies, his voice and Buck Owens' voice just were a perfect match. They both had perfect like tone. They could sing hard. They nailed harmonies. Their guitar work together was phenomenal. They ended up getting matching Stratocasters, which was like, those guitars have gone on to, they're in museums now. And, but like they just had this crazy bond, and them on stage together playing the twin guitars, just knocking out shows for giant crowds. And they're the best of friends. And then in 1974, Don Rich dies in a motorcycle accident, and it just chops the legs off of Buck Owens. He experiences what is later described as an extended psychotic break, which really he gets severely depressed and can't bring himself to really dive into the music thing anymore. And he does some stuff, and he's still running the publishing company, and he's still involved, but every time the Buckaroos played a gig after that, it was just a reminder that Don's not there. And that's a hole that he just could not fill. So he kind of comes away from music totally, and he just does the hee-haw thing for a bunch of years. And, that while it was successful, he was not doing well at the time. Like Buck was, like I said, he's severely depressed. And that, kind of culminates. And then he also, he gets divorced again. And then in 1977, he marries the fiddle player from the Buckaroos. Her name was, Jana J. Grafe. But there's some different versions of the story here where like they get the marriage annulled like the next day. And then some versions say that it was like, they just separated immediately and the divorce wasn't finalized till later. But anyway, very short-lived marriage to Jana J. And then so that's 1977. 2 years later, in 1979, he marries Jennifer Smith, who is his fourth wife. And they get divorced later too. But so then 1986, he leaves Hee Haw, and he decides, I'm done. This is not, this isn't doing it for me. So he leaves the show, and he basically just starts playing tennis with his sons. And he describes it as like, you can only play so much tennis, and you can only play so much golf. Like, but this is that's where he is at the time in the late 80s. But that only lasts for like, a year or two that he's in that sort of depressed, now not working at all spot, like at least not on TV, and he's not cranking out any new records. Well, here we are in 1986 or 1987. Here comes Dwight Yoakam. And Dwight Yoakam was he loved Buck Owens. Buck Owens was one of Dwight Yoakam's, kind of musical heroes. And he had been experiencing a very similar story arc where he was like, Nashville just wasn't doing it for him. LA wasn't really doing it for him either. He wanted to be able to play his style of music and write his songs. And that's what Dwight Yoakam proceeds to do. He moves to Bakersfield. And that's kind of where he, starts cutting his teeth on that kind of thing. Because at the time, even before, Buck Owens described his first appearance on the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville. He said they controlled everything. He's like, he said that he had never not had control of the volume of his guitar before. If you're on that show, they did all the mixing. They controlled all the tones. They controlled the volume of the drum kit, like everything. They had full control over your sound if you're playing on the Opry, which he said was a weird experience, but it didn't bother him too much because playing on the Opry was still a good feather in the cap. So he wasn't that mad about it, but that was years before. But he learned his lesson about Nashville and kind of the control. It kind of just, reaffirmed his belief that Bakersfield was the place to be. So then, here we are, 1987, Dwight Yoakam comes along. And Dwight Yoakam was experiencing success already. Like he was, he'd kind of gotten his big break before this, but he loved Buck Owens, and seeing Buck Owens sort of out to pasture like that bothered him. And he comes to town to play, I think, a county fair, and just decides, you know what, I'm going to go see if Buck wants to come play, because he did some of Buck Owens' songs in his show. Like that was, it was his musical hero. Their styles are very similar, like guitar work wise and stuff. So he's playing near Bakersfield. And so he decides to just show up at Buck's office. And, he goes with like some trepidation, but like, I'll see if I can get Buck to come join me on stage. Well, at this time, like, so Buck's tired of golf and tennis, and apparently, as soon as Dwight is like, hey, how about you come play on stage with me at the fair? It took him like 3 seconds to say yes. And he's like, yep, let's go do it. And so they do. And it's great. And it kind of rekindles the excitement in Buck Owens. And he's sort of like, obviously he's still upset about losing Don Rich, but seeing Dwight Yoakam, kind of this next generation of guys come through and have so much love and respect for the music up to that point, really kind of did rekindle Buck's love for music and for the music scene in Bakersfield. And so, I think in 1988, yeah. So on stage, like at the show in 1987, he, at the end of playing, I think they played Act Naturally, I think. Or no, they played The Streets of Bakersfield. Okay. They played, at the end of playing The Streets of Bakersfield, which was Buck Owens' song from 1973, I think, which I think had topped out at number 6 on the charts. It never hit number 1 for Buck Owens when he first released it. Cut to 1988 or 87. He's on stage with Dwight Yoakam, and at the end of the song, he kind of looks over at Dwight and he's like, Dwight, you ought to cut that. That'll be number 1 if you do it. And so they do, and it was. It's this giant success. And so, Dwight does it with Buck Owens, and the two of them record this song together. It's a classic, and it takes off, and that does hit number 1. And that was Buck's first number 1 record in 16 years at the time. So since his last number 1, 16 years go by. Because I think his last number 1 was in 1972. So like 16 years and some change go by. And here he is back on stage, back at number 1. And you got to remember at this time too, like, he's financially fine. Like, Buck Owens made all the money on his shows and records and his publishing company. Like, he financially, he could have kept playing golf forever, but he just got tired of it. So when Dwight Yoakam shows up, they cut this song. It's number 1. It kind of shoves Buck Owens back into the spotlight, and he starts doing shows again. And, that goes, pretty well. Like, he then, this is the stage of the game where he buys and builds Buck's Crystal Palace. Buck Owens' Crystal Palace is like, now it's this legendary music venue in Bakersfield. And it's sort of, it rings the same way that, like, the way Joe Rogan did for comedy recently when he opens the Mothership, and it's just kind of built for comedians. Buck Owens does that with the Crystal Palace, and it's like, it's a music venue. And he's, he wanted a place where artists could come and play their type of music and, not be as, squeezed by outside influence. And so I think that was in 1988. No, that was way later. That was in 1996 that he opened the Crystal Palace. Because the same year he's inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, which he obviously was stoked about. Did not see that coming for him, I guess. He'd also gotten cancer like before that. In 1993, he went through throat cancer, like surgery for throat cancer, and he actually had to have like a chunk of his tongue removed. So there's not a ton of performances after that, but so he's inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1996. And would, he continues to have his impact and influence on the artists around, and he kind of becomes this like, country music royalty character that everybody wants to play. Like, Brad Paisley worked with him a bunch, like in this time later on. So and the Crystal Palace sort of became Buck's like playground. He would just go play shows, and then there's a funny story about how I think he had a Ferrari at this stage, and he would just leave it running in the parking lot of the Crystal Palace, go on stage, play, jump in his car, and go home. That was what he loved to do. He would just leave the Ferrari running. And it was weird because normally, you're a small act, you go to the Crystal Palace, you expect to be opening for somebody. Well, Buck Owens would be the opener. Like, he would just go on and open the show and then leave. He would just show up, leave his car running in the parking lot, play a few songs, open the show up. Hey, here's this new artist, whoever. And then he'd get in his car and go home. Which, seemed to work pretty well for him for a while. And so Buck Owens' influence spans all kinds of genres. And So he dies in 2006. He has a heart attack and dies in his sleep. So later, so Dwight Yoakam obviously had never lost any, of that love for Buck Owens, and he really, and they grew close afterwards because they Dwight Yoakam was instrumental in bringing him into this next peak of his life here. And so after he dies, they do like a benefit, or not a benefit, but like a memorial concert, which was crazy because the people on stage, it was, what's funny is if you go back and watch it, Vince Vaughn, the actor, somehow ends up being gifted from Buck Owens, like he I guess, knew him before he died, is given Buck's guitar and is like his prized possession that he's like, nobody touches that guitar. Well, at this benefit thing, he lets Brad Paisley play it. So on stage, it's Brad Paisley, Buck Owens' son. I think it's, I'm going to get this wrong. I think it's Michael, but I'm not sure about that. But one of his sons, who looks astonishingly like Buck Owens, by the way. So Brad Paisley, one of Buck's sons, Chris Hillman from the Byrds, who we talked about in our Graham Parsons episode, he ends up on stage at this thing. And the drummer is the drummer from Blink 182. So it's hilarious. Like they're out there playing Buck Owens songs, got the tiger by the tail. And there's the Blink 182 guy with his giant mohawk and his tattoos and his wife beater. And he's just rocking out in the background. But that, and then like I said, Chris Hillman of the Byrds is there. It was this perfect sort of snapshot of where Buck's influence landed across the music scene. And it's still to this day, like even now, like you go to Bakersfield and that's like the country music capital of California is Bakersfield. And yeah, goes on into legend. So that is our Buck Owens episode. Thank you all for watching, and we will see you next week.